Greetings, friends. I am Vitaly Portnikov. New negotiations between the American and Iranian delegations regarding Iran's nuclear program will take place in a week in Amman. The special representative of the President of the United States, Steve Witkoff, and Iran's Foreign Minister, Abbas Araghchi, communicated with each other for only 2 hours, with the mediation of the head of Oman's Foreign Affairs Department, Badr bin Ahmad al-Busaidi. However, Witkoff and Araghchi were able to communicate directly with each other for a few minutes, and likely this circumstance allows the United States to declare the negotiations with Tehran as direct as President Donald Trump insisted. Meanwhile, Tehran points out that practically the entire negotiation process took place with Omani mediation. In other words, the negotiations were not directed as the supreme leader of Iran, Ayatollah Khamenei, insisted. On the eve of the negotiations, information emerged that the United States was ready to make significant concessions to Iran. This was stated by Steve Witkoff himself, and the media provided explanations for these concessions. First and foremost, the United States no longer objects to Iran continuing its nuclear program. This exclusively concerns the abandonment of its military component. Furthermore, during the negotiations between the American and Iranian delegations, the issue of Iran's production of ballistic missiles and its support for numerous terrorist organizations of the so-called axis of resistance will not be discussed. In other words, Steve Witkoff wants to focus exclusively on the issue of Iran's potential acquisition of nuclear weapons, which is unlikely to satisfy Israel, whose leadership has already faced missile bombardments from the Islamic Republic, and Israel managed to withstand several attacks from Iran, only thanks to massive support from allies and the destruction of the Iranian arsenal before Iran's missiles entered Israeli airspace. However, the way the current American administration conducts negotiations became clear from the consultations that Steve Witkoff is holding with Russian President Vladimir Putin. It is evident that this style, focusing on the main issues and disregarding others' interests, will be decisive in the negotiation between Washington and Tehran. For Iran, the most important thing now is to prolong these negotiations as long as possible. After all, we clearly understand what the leadership of the Islamic Republic is interested in. For them, it is crucial to maintain Iran's ability to produce nuclear weapons. The current conditions being discussed by Steve Witkoff and Abbas Araghchi are quite close to the conditions that the United States proposed to Iran back when Barack Obama was the US president, and the nuclear deal was reached, which Donald Trump later decided to withdraw from. At that time, Iran indeed gave up the lion's share of its nuclear stockpiles, but retained the ability to produce nuclear weapons if it obtained the necessary materials. And after the United States withdrew from the nuclear deal, information emerged that Iran could now create several nuclear bombs at any moment. It is evident that at the current stage of negotiations, Iran would also like to retain the tools for producing nuclear weapons. Meanwhile, the Ayatollah regime could give up the materials that are supposed to aid such production, just as it has done before. In this way, a possible attack on Iran by the United States will be prevented, and Iran will retain the ability to return to nuclear weapons production, for example, after Donald Trump's presidential term ends and the next American president may not be as harshly disposed towards the Islamic Republic. Currently, in Tehran, they will simply try to buy time. It is clear that the current first round of negotiations is more technical, and one can speak of the success of American diplomacy, at least because Iranian leaders agreed to negotiations with the United States shortly after Ayatollah Khamenei had categorically refused to hold such consultations. But the consultations themselves may take quite a long time. In Iran, they will try to understand when Donald Trump's patience will finally run out and what he will do if he realizes that the negotiations are dragging on. In other words, by and large, Ayatollah Khamenei is acting towards Trump in much the same way as Russian Federation President Vladimir Putin acted towards Trump the day before the negotiations between Withoff and Arakci, who also met with the special representative of the American president. At the same time, the fact that negotiations are taking place simultaneously with Putin and with Iranian representatives is advantageous for Tehran. Putin can play the role of mediator between the United States and Iran, proving that he can persuade the leadership of the Islamic Republic to make greater concessions, thereby helping Iran in prolonging negotiations with the United States. And the American representative might believe that Russia's participation in the negotiation process with Iran could help Donald Trump persuade Vladimir Putin to make concessions on the ceasefire issue on the Russian-Ukrainian front. Thus, Putin and Ayatollah Khamenei can play a double game by prolonging the situation in negotiations, both with Russia and with Iran. And, of course, a game that is meant to leave Donald Trump looking foolish. The president of the Russian Federation and Ayatollah Khamenei, of course, share this ambition. Moreover, the fact that Donald Trump has sent the same person to both the Russian-American negotiations and the American-Iranian negotiations, who, judging by what we see and hear, holds a reverence for the president of the Russian Federation and is ready to believe all the nonsense that Vladimir Putin tells him, not to mention the tempting offers made to him by Kirill Dmitriev, the special representative of the Russian president. For international economic cooperation, the task becomes even easier. After all, what does Moscow need? To continue negotiations with the United States and continue the war with Ukraine? And what does Tehran need? To continue negotiations with the United States and to strengthen and camouflage its capabilities for producing nuclear weapons. These are, in fact, the goals of that process, at the center of which Steve Witkoff unexpectedly found himself. Thank you, friends. Stay on this channel, subscribe if you haven't already, to my social networks, to the channels on Patreon, Buy Me a Coffee, and Donatello, which help develop these resources, plus the sponsorship feature on YouTube itself. Peace to you.